If you want to feel like a superhero, you could take your alter ego and head into this Art Deco building and pretend that it's the Daily Planet. That's what George Reeves did when he became the first actor to really popularize the character of Superman and his alter ego Clark Kent in the world of film and television on The Adventures of Superman. It's pretty debatable whether or not George is more remembered for playing Superman or if he's more remembered for his tragic, untimely, and very mysterious death. Oddly enough, though, it's George's life that fascinates me most, which is why he is the subject of today's story location tour. We're going to see a lot of where his life took place, and I am going to cover his last days, but if you've seen my previous tours, you know I like to start from the very beginning and crawl our way to the end, bogging us down with really fun details and interwoven tidbits that hopefully give you a better sense of just who the brilliant and extremely talented George Reeves really was. About 16 miles from Hollywood is the spectacular city of Pasadena, home to, of course, the Rose Bowl, and they also have a great historical area called Old Town Pasadena. They're kind of known for their homes out here. They range from stately, enormous mansions to beautiful vintage craftsmen. So many films and television shows have filmed out here in Pasadena, particularly when they want to represent the Midwest, exemplifying that all-American neighborhood, as they did in Back to the Future and Halloween. And fittingly enough, it would be the neighborhood where our Superman would grow up. He was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 5th, 1914, but he wouldn't know his real birthday for a while. His mother, Helen Lesher, actually altered his birth certificate because little George came into this world 5 months after Helen had married his father, Don Brewer, whom she met while he was in school studying pharmaceuticals. Altering George's birth date to April 6th would hide the fact that he was conceived out of wedlock. Not only was Helen very Catholic, but back then, a child out of wedlock could ruin you. I mean, women couldn't even vote back in 1914, let alone have babies without society needing every little detail. Especially considering that Helen's family was wealthy and well-known in social circles. But none of this would end up mattering anyway, because shortly after George was born, Helen divorced Don, and she and her baby boy moved around the Midwest to Kentucky for a bit, and then eventually settled down in her hometown of Galesburg, Illinois. However, Helen had a sister who lived out here in Pasadena, which led her and her baby boy, George, to move out here and call this craftsman house home. Now, you will read on Wikipedia and most blogs that Helen and George moved out here in 1927, upon which she married a man by the name of Frank Besselo. This just isn't true. She did in fact marry Frank, but this happened sometime around 1919, and the 1920 Pasadena City Directory lists Frank, Helen, and little George already living here in this house on North Michigan Avenue, which, by the way, looks almost the exact same. I'm also in love with it. I mean, give me a front porch, a corner lot, a tall palm tree in the front yard, and I am good to go. Actually, no, I need it to be in the hills with a view and a pool that looks out on the view of downtown LA. All right, so I need a lot more than this, but it's really just super charming and so well maintained. I love the long sidewalk too, but I just remembered it only has 2 bathrooms. Can't do that. Not with 5 bedrooms. I mean, there's 2,700 square feet. I think we could build a 3rd bathroom. But seriously, aside from just some upgrades here and there over the years, you're basically looking at the exact same house George grew up in. There are great photos online at jimnolt.com, a website that's really just a masterclass in everything George Reeves. They show a toddler-age George out here in Pasadena. I actually reached out to Jim, who was so kind, and he even let me use some photos. Thank you, Jim. In one of the photos, we see a very young George with Frank, so we know he had to have been out here several years before 1927. The confusion may stem from the fact that Frank officially adopted George in 1927 when he was a teenager. This all happened quietly behind George's back, however, because Helen and Frank raised George to believe that Frank was his biological father. He wasn't appeasing Helen either. He actually took a vested interest in George's life, and the two had a very strong bond from the time George was a very young boy. They grew to love one another, and as George grew into a young man, they started sharing some of the same passions for cooking and liquor. Also, these flowers are so beautiful. I have to remember to come back here at night and make a few bouquets. They're just stunning. My God, I'm so kidding. Could you imagine? Anyway, Frank, he had been in the banking industry, but after the stock market crash of 1929, he began working in the liquor industry, in the brewing and distribution departments. They really looked like that all-American family, mom and dad raising their son, and again, Frank just wasn't fulfilling the father figure role. For all intents and purposes, he was George's father. They even shared a legal last name. Frank and Helen would raise little George Besselo right here in this home that was built in 1914, the same year George was born, and it would be a house that would stay in George's life up until the very end of it. In 1884, Pasadena High School opened, and in 1924, Pasadena Junior College was founded. 4 years later, in 1928, the two would officially merge, and in 1947, it would become what it's known as today, Pasadena City College. But it was here in the late 20s, early 30s, where George Besselo would attend, getting his first infectious, rabid bite from the acting bug. I cannot stress enough how important and vital the arts are to education, and I think it's worth pointing out here because this country still has a lot of parents who, well, none of you, those of you watching this video, you're all educated and have enough common sense to know the importance of art, but there's still a whole world of people out there who would balk at the idea of their son going into theater. You know, not my son, he's going to be masculine and play sports. Well, guess what? Superman, one of the most recognizable symbols of American culture's idea of masculinity, was portrayed by a theater kid. And not just a drama class kid, a theater kid. Theater. The lionization of George's Clark Kent / Superman portrayal wouldn't exist had George's education not included the arts. This school, it offers a wide array of classes and has a very rich history. Albert Einstein was on hand in 1931 for the opening of an observatory building here on campus. George was attending then, but I have no idea if he crossed paths with Mr. Einstein or not. And immediately after George graduated, Jackie Robinson and his older brother Mac became Pasadena Bulldogs. Jackie, of course, went on to become someone whose face would be on baseball's Mount Rushmore if it existed, but Mac Robinson, not quite as remembered. He ran as a member of the 1936 Olympic Games, representing the United States in Munich, Germany, and continued to break records, dominating the world of track and field. The two men accomplished so much in their sports careers just here at the school alone. They aren't the only famous alumni who attended Pasadena Junior College. The Rock band Van Halen, based out of Pasadena, were alumni, including David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen. So were Boys in the Hood director John Singleton, Kenny Loggins, Bob Mackie, Kim Carnes, who sang Betty Davis Eyes, William Holden, author Clive Cussler, and James Dean. But not that James Dean, James Dean, the adult film actor. And on the not-so-noble alumni side, you have Armie Hammer, and Fred Phelps, who founded the Westboro Baptist Church, and the equally disgusting Charles Manson. Yes, that one. Really, though, the list of alumni on their wiki page is just filled with people, many of them athletes and coaches, really too many people to name, but this has been a great, great school for decades. In addition to being a theater kid, George also took up singing. He played guitar, he was fluent in Spanish, but it wasn't just the arts that interested him. He really was a well-rounded young man who was also very athletic. He participated in sports, becoming an amateur boxer for a short period, even participating in the Pasadena Golden Gloves matches in 1933. But it was the year before, 1932, when George's life was absolutely rocked. He was 18, attending school here, when his cousin, the daughter of Helen's sister, told George the truth about Frank Besselo being his stepfather and not his biological father. George rightfully freaked out and confronted his mother, who actually confessed and said it was all true. She also told George that his real dad, Don Brewer, had committed suicide. She told George that she had kept it all from him because she never wanted him to find out that painful, tragic truth. What made matters worse is also that year, Helen and Frank divorced. Now, this is where the story gets convoluted because for years it's been said that Helen also told George that Frank had gone and killed himself. But that story, it's been debunked because too many of George's friends have recalled actually going with George to Frank's new place in Manhattan Beach, even after he took a new wife who had teenage sons of her own. Frank had built a new life for himself far from Pasadena, and he ran a liquor store in town, and it's also been said that he and George remained close, despite this truth coming to light, even up until Frank died in 1944 at the age of 51, when George was by now a working actor in Hollywood. However, Frank's obituary says no mention of George whatsoever. And I also find it hard to believe that Helen would tell George that both of the most important male figures in his life committed suicide, because the truth is, both stories were lies. Now, here's what we know for sure. Frank Besselo died on February 23, 1944, from multiple embolisms. He died in the ambulance from his Manhattan Beach home on the way to the hospital. We also know that Don Brewer, George's biological father, died on February 18, 1969, at the age of 79. Not only did he not commit suicide either, but he was still alive the day that George found this all out. And he remained alive 10 years after George died. For the remaining 27 years of his life, George could have had a relationship with his real dad had Helen not put an end to that with her own lies. Now, here's where it gets even more twisted and muddy. Stay with me. There has been a story going around for years that during a public appearance in, I think, Cleveland, once George was a big star, that supposedly his real dad came backstage and introduced himself, but then basically rejected George because he didn't want his new wife and 2 kids to learn about his past. There isn't any proof to back this up, and it's pretty safe to say George never again saw his biological father and never even got to know that he was still alive. The story seems to be made up, supposedly to fit some sort of, Superman fandom narrative that George Reeves, like Clark Kent, had also been rejected by his biological father. Regardless of how it all played out, there's no denying that it was an incredible shock to young George Besselo. He was apparently so angry with his mom that it put a rift in their extremely close relationship for a short period, and he was deeply depressed about the whole situation, which is why I believe he decided to continue his passion for acting on stage. It wasn't just a course at school for him. So in 1935, 21-year-old George decided to take it to the next level by pursuing his talents on stage here at the world-renowned Pasadena Playhouse, one of the most famous playhouses in the world. It opened here in 1925, and in 1928, the College of Theater Arts, shown here on this plaque, was formed through the University of California. It lasted until 1969, and some of the 5,000 students during this era included Ernest Borgnine, Raymond Burr, Sally Struthers, Gene Hackman, Dustin Hoffman, and Rue McClanahan. The Playhouse was officially founded in 1917 by a man named Gilmore Brown. He served as the manager and artistic director up until his death in 1960 at the age of 73. He was born in North Dakota but fell in love with theater while attending high school in Denver. His family, they eventually moved to Pasadena, and around 1916 he started this little theater company here and there around town. This brought the community together so strongly that it was the citizens of Pasadena who raised the money to eventually have all of this built so that Gilmore's Little Theater could have a permanent home. And it was designed by a local Pasadena artist and architect named Elmer Gray. Gray's previous success had been a magnificent hotel opened in 1912 that we still call the Beverly Hills Hotel. Gray has many homes and structures still standing all throughout the LA area, built between 1906 and the 1930s. This one, of course, being named a registered historical landmark. Now, the theater had a main stage, as well as a playbox theater, which was Gilmore's private theater, and a laboratory, or a workshop theater. This was for new unproduced plays to sort of find their legs. But back to 1935, George, he began an apprenticeship here at the theater as Gilmore Brown's assistant. George, he even accompanied Brown to Europe to find new plays to bring back to the States. George had graduated from the college and was now in need of a job. Working for Brown, it gave him a paycheck and a chance to hone his craft as a theatrical actor. That summer, June 8th, George appeared in his very first play. It was called Promise. And, oh, this is fun. Over here is a bell. It's the Victor Jory bell. Victor was an actor of stage, screen, and television who also would become great friends with George. Victor was in George's very first film, one that you have most certainly heard of, which we'll get to next. But not only that, Victor and George would go on to act in 7 films together. Also, Victor would direct George in 1947 here at the Playhouse in The Girl of the Golden West. Now, Victor actually gave this bell to the theater while George was starting out here. It was meant to be rung right before showtime and right when intermission was ending. Gilmore Brown, he died in 1960, and the theater struggled until it was shut down in 1969. The bell went missing. But in 1996, the children of Victor Jory discovered that his bell had been sitting in the basement of the Pasadena Historical Museum, so it was brought here, back home at the Playhouse, where it continues to remind patrons to take their seats. And, oh, I love this. I love this so much. The workshop theater I mentioned is now called the Carrie Hamilton Theater, a 99-seat theater named after Carrie, who was an actress, a playwright, a musician, and also the daughter of Carol Burnett. Carrie passed away in 2002, and 4 years later, in 2006, this upstairs theater was officially named the Carrie Hamilton Theater. Carol was, of course, on hand for the dedication, and anyone who's watched my show or follows me on Instagram will know just how important Carol Burnett is to me. I made a 7-part story location tour on her, which she saw and then invited me to her 90th birthday party. I also, believe it or not, just interviewed Carol a few weeks ago for my show and will be posting that episode shortly. Really, though, so many fascinating stories from this theater, like Fanny Morrison, a very wealthy woman who in 1930 went to the box office and asked about the theater's schooling and classes. She was told of the financial woes that were going on and eventually donated $340,000 so the theater could build a 6-story annex behind it, enabling all the theater students to get their education here on the property of the Pasadena Playhouse. What an angel. The popularity of the Pasadena Playhouse kicked off the community playhouse movement that happened all across the country. And 2 years after George Besselo appeared in his first play here, it was cited as the only theater in all of the United States to have produced every single play by William Shakespeare. California officially declared it the State Theater of California, an honor it still beholds to this day. Now, I told you the school shut down in 1969. Then the theater itself fell into bankruptcy, and that too closed. Its future was up in the air for a while, and believe it or not, this entire property stayed closed for 17 years. Finally, in 1986, with the city of Pasadena now in charge of it, the Pasadena Playhouse reopened, and it continues to put on plays, readings, musicals, and all sorts of great shows to thousands and thousands of theater-loving patrons. We'd be here for days if I told you everyone who's ever acted here, from Ariana Grande and Angela Bassett to Al Pacino and John Ritter. Not only that, but the list of people who have sponsored and donated is just as noteworthy. I mean, you can see Lucille Ball's name, Groucho Marx, but back to our pal George. He didn't just dabble in theater because he worked for the Playhouse's founder. George lived it. He was an actor. His blood, his sweat, the tears, it all went into his craft. And, keep in mind, he started here just a couple years after he learned the truth about his real fathers. I mean, think of the layers to that. He grows up thinking he was half Italian, then learns, no, bro, you're Scottish and Irish. Also, what if he believed in astrology? Now he has a whole new sign and birthstone. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but his entire culture changed, and I can't help but think this was a major factor in him realizing just how well he could play different people, different characters. I don't know, perhaps this was a world where he could escape or disappear into roles, giving him some sort of reprieve from wondering who he really was. In 1936, his second year here, George did Shakespeare. He was in Antony and Cleopatra, Timon of Athens, and Julius Caesar. He was in a play called Paths to Glory, and he also did A Christmas Carol that same year. The next year, 1937, he did 11 more plays here, and in 1938, he did 8 plays. He continued to act in plays here throughout the 40s. He really never stopped. But in 1939, the world would see a whole new George, thanks to a talent scout who just so happened to catch one of his plays here at the Pasadena Playhouse. From 1935 to 1943, producer David O. Selznick created his own studio, Selznick International Pictures, right here on Jefferson Boulevard in Culver City. He had been quite successful at RKO and MGM, where his father-in-law, Louis B. Mayer, was CEO. But longing to be an independent producer, Selznick, he left his gig at MGM to live out his dream right behind all of these windows. This place really deserves its own story location tour someday because the history here is, it's just so rich. It began as Ince Studios in 1918, founded by silent film actor, director, writer, producer Thomas Ince. But 6 years later, Ince died unexpectedly following a trip on William Randolph Hearst's yacht. I mean, rumors are still swirling to this day as to what happened. Some say Hearst shot him, thinking he was Charlie Chaplin, who he was really trying to shoot because he thought Chaplin was having an affair with his mistress, Marion Davies. Honestly, there are a ton of theories as to what happened, and I mean, this too needs its own story tour. But after Ince died, his widow sold these studios to Cecil B. DeMille, who, of course, renamed this place DeMille Studios. They only lasted a few years. He merged his company with Pathé Pictures, who then merged with RKO, and it became RKO Pathé Studios from 1932 until Mr. Selznick stepped in. And in those 8 short years that the studio was up and running, he managed to produce some integral pieces of cinema. Selznick, he did the 1937 A Star is Born and 2 Alfred Hitchcock gems, Spellbound and Rebecca, which brought him his second of back-to-back Best Picture Oscars in 1940. The year before, 1939, he won his first Best Picture for Gone with the Wind, the most successful movie of all time. Even adjusted for inflation today, it still holds the record for the most money earned from a film. Yes, even surpassing Avatar, and honestly, it'll probably never be beat. And not a single frame of this Atlanta set epic was even filmed in Georgia. It was all shot here in California. The casting call for Scarlett O'Hara is stuff of legend. Every actress under the sun was tested for this film, but as we know, a little unknown British actress named Vivien Leigh landed the role of the Southern Belle heroine. Gone with the Wind, it began filming on January 26, 1939, and the very first scene to be filmed would take place on the front porch of Tara, where Scarlett O'Hara and the Tarleton twins discuss the possibility of an upcoming war. Brent Tarleton would be played by an actor named Fred Crane, and his on-screen twin brother, Stuart Tarleton, would be played by a brand new actor, fresh from the Pasadena Playhouse, named George Besselo. George, he had been spotted by a talent scout, and this role, although a very small role, led to a contract with Warner Brothers. In addition to a new gig and a new contract, George would also have a new last name. Nobody thought George Besselo would make a great marquee name for a leading man, so from this point forward, he would be known as George Reeves. Ironically, however, he and Fred Crane, they were erroneously listed in the film's credits. The first names of their twin characters really should be swapped. But directing Vivian, Fred, and George would be the brilliant George Cukor. Cukor today, of course, is known as a master filmmaker. His work includes The Women, The Philadelphia Story, Gaslight, My Fair Lady, and Little Women. But Cukor didn't have as much luck on this film. It was plagued with problems from the get-go. For starters, Selznick did not like the results of the very first scene. He wasn't fond of the hair dye used on the twins. He also thought something was off about Vivian's look, too. He ordered reshoots, and this time the twins showed up on set with darker hair, and Vivian wore a black choker around her neck. But Selznick still wasn't pleased. Mostly now, though, because of the set and the lighting. Eventually, just a few weeks into production, Cukor was fired, and Selznick replaced him with director Victor Fleming, who made a little movie called The Wizard of Oz. Fleming, he would go on to finish Gone with the Wind and would win the Academy Award for Best Director. However, he too was having issues with the Tarleton twins scene. He shot it on a different side of the porch, and it was pointed out on set that a Southern lady like Scarlett would never be seen in a dress that revealing on an afternoon alone, unchaperoned with two young men. So Selznick ordered yet another reshoot. This time, because she had been out shooting nonstop since January, Vivien Leigh looked exhausted and worn out. Selznick saw it, everyone saw it. So he ordered her to take a vacation. She went to Europe, and upon her return in October, she stepped before the cameras one last time as Scarlett O'Hara. Looking well-rested and refreshed, Vivien Leigh and the Tarleton twins, now sporting a ginger look, completed the final scene scheduled, which ironically would be the opening scene to this cinematic masterpiece that would go on to win 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. And George's bell-ringing pal from the Pasadena Playhouse, Victor Jory, also had a small role in Gone with the Wind. And this building is actually the very first image seen in the film, with the Selznick sign hanging right where we're standing. And the burning of Tara was actually the burning of this studio's backlot. Selznick, he wanted to get rid of several old Ince and DeMille sound stages to make room for new and better ones. So he burned them all to the ground and figured, hey, let's film it and make it look like Atlanta. George Reeves not only found a film career at the Pasadena Playhouse, but he found love. Gone with the Wind was released on December 15th, 1939, and the following year, George would marry Eleonora Needles, sometimes called Eleanor. She was an actress from a family of very well-known circus performers. She and George met while studying at the Playhouse. Now, Gone with the Wind was George's first film, but as I told you, his scene took 5 attempts over the course of almost a year. So in the interim, he was fulfilling his Warner Brothers contract with short films and really small parts in forgettable films. He was also acting again at the Playhouse, though. He and Eleonora, they hit it off, fell in love, and got married here at Our Savior Church in San Gabriel. The first Protestant church in the San Gabriel Valley opened in 1867, and it's not that far from George's house in Pasadena, about 10-15 minutes. In fact, the rehearsal dinner and the wedding reception were both held at the house. George's mom, of course, hosting. But their ceremony took place right here on September 22nd, 1940. George was 26, Eleonora was 22. There's been very little written about this marriage, which is kind of surprising because they were married for 10 years. The demise of this relationship, it isn't entirely clear. There have been rumors that George caught Eleonora in bed with another man, the man she married after George. Some also said that George was told he could become a major movie star if he divorced her and was single. But in the late 70s, Eleonora gave an interview to a journalist basically saying that George couldn't have children. Eleonora, she really wanted a family of her own, and after several attempts, she decided to see a doctor. Everything seemed to be on the up and up on her end, but when it came time for George to have medical tests run, he refused. They divorced in 1950, and like I said, Eleonora remarried and was able to have 2 daughters with her new husband. She died in 2002 at the age of 83. During the decade that they were married, they actually appeared in a movie together. The father of one of their fellow Pasadena Playhouse students was producing a film, 1943's Leather Burners. He gave parts to several of the actors there, including our bell-ringing pal Victor Jory, and in the film was another up-and-coming future movie star named Robert Mitchum. Also in 1943, America would finally see George Reeves in a leading role in a film released by a major studio. All right, you know what I'm going to say next. This place deserves its own story location tour. Well, it does. Come on, it's Paramount Pictures. You'd have to live in a cave if you've never heard of it. It's been here for ages, and I still think it is one of the most beautiful entrances in town. I actually told the very early beginning story of how Paramount came to be in part 1 of my last tour, Hollywood's first murder mystery. But in the first half of the 40s decade, Paramount was doing their part to aid in the efforts of World War II. There were a bunch of new rules in place. The government was now involved with filmmaking and was trying to call all the shots. It was a nightmare of a mess for Paramount. However, they did make a really dated but good movie that's not so popular today, although it did receive 4 Oscar nominations, and it is one that gave George Reeves one of his first big starring roles. So Proudly We Hail, about 3 American nurses sent to the Philippines during the war. They were played by 3 huge stars of the day, Claudette Colbert, Paulette Goddard, and, talk about movie star, Veronica Lake. George, he played Lieutenant John Summer. He had romantic scenes, really great chemistry, and a great presence on screen. And this finally got him some notice. It was also directed by a man named Mark Sandrich. If you've ever watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show or the Golden Girls, you've seen the name Jay Sandrich. Well, Mark was his father, and Mark loved working with George on this. In fact, the story goes that Mark Sandrich had big plans and ideas for projects that he could direct and George could star in. However, tragically, Mark died of a heart attack a couple years after So Proudly We Hail came out, and George always believed his best shot at film stardom died with Mark.
The success of Gone with the Wind really should have helped George's film career take off, but it didn't. In fact, it went downhill pretty quickly, although he did manage to appear in a handful of westerns and also appeared in some films with some pretty big stars, like 1941's The Strawberry Blonde with James Cagney, Olivia de Havilland, and Rita Hayworth. Oh, he also did another Rita Hayworth movie, Blood and Sand, starring Tyrone Power and Linda Darnell. And George also appeared in a Ronald Reagan film, Knute Rockne's All-American. But for the most part, the first half of the 1940s saw George appearing in a bunch of really forgettable films with some pretty forgotten casts. So it didn't come as a huge surprise when George put his film career on hold and enlisted in the U.S. military. In 1943, George entered the United States Army Air Forces, working in the film unit. He made training films and videos about sexually transmitted diseases. However, by the end of the year, George was appearing on Broadway. The Army produced Winged Victory, a play written by Moss Hart that essentially served as a morale booster and a fundraiser for the Army's Emergency Relief Fund. It was wildly successful. It ran for 226 performances, and they even did a movie version. George appeared in it and was reunited with his former Gone with the Wind director, George Cukor. Now, After George was discharged, he returned to Hollywood, but again, the second half of the 40s saw much of the same thing. Very little film stardom. Also, 1949 saw the end of George's marriage to Eleanor, so he moved to New York temporarily, where he appeared on radio shows and even did a live anthology series on this new thing called television. But New York didn't last long. In the spring of 1951, George was cast in Fritz Lang's Rancho Notorious, starring Marlene Dietrich. So he moved back to Hollywood, and he also appeared in Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah, starring Hedy Lamarr. Again, great co-stars, but films just weren't happening. So I'm sure George wasn't even fazed when he signed on to play the lead in DC Comics' very first full-length feature film.
Oh, look, we're back in Culver City. George had to come back here, so we have to as well. All right, so legendary tycoon Howard Hughes, he bought the Selznick Studios in 1950. RKO Pathé, they resumed productions while Selznick ran a new production company, Vanguard Films, right here on the lot. Hughes, he leased the studios out to multiple and various companies, one of which was a production company called Lippert Productions. They were going to be making the very first full-length feature film of a DC comic book. Now, there had been DC comics turned into these anthology series and shorts, but this was the first full-length film, and it would be called Superman and the Mole Man. Now, just to give you an idea of how small comic book movies were back then, this one was filmed in about 12 days in the summer of 1951. Then it was released that fall in November. Nothing at all like today. Now, Superman, he had been portrayed on radio. He was voiced by Bud Collyer, and there had been a movie serial that was more aimed at children, where Superman was played by a man named Kirk Allen. But for the first feature-length film, they had someone else in mind. George Reeves, of course, was cast as Clark Kent / Superman, and Lois Lane was played by an actress named Phyllis Coates, who, by the way, is still with us at the age of 96. And she delighted Superman fans when she played mother to Terry Hatcher's Lois Lane in the 1990s New Adventures of Superman. But this movie, however, was meant to serve as a TV pilot for a new series called The Adventures of Superman. In fact, they actually started shooting the series here on the lot before the movie was even released. And today, if you play the lead superhero in a series or film, you are making a ton of money. A ton. But back then, the budget for each episode was about $15,000, and the cast was paid a jaw-dropping $200 an episode. This was not a network show. It was meant for syndication. And in 1951, while I Love Lucy was extremely popular and in the process of changing the world of television, it still wasn't considered a respectful medium for actors. Not at all like television is today. Lucy was doing television because her film career had gone to the graveyard. Actors going from films to television, it was considered a major demotion. After George reluctantly read for the part and got the offer, it wasn't, oh my God, are you serious? I get to be Superman? It was more, are you kidding? I have to do TV? Get this. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz bought the old Selznick Culver empire in 1957, and they ran their Desilu Productions here until 1968. See? Own story location tour. So much history. But in 2017, Amazon moved into the Culver Studios, where they still operate today, as you can see. But back in that summer of 1951, the cast and crew of The Adventures of Superman filmed season 1. Now, in addition to Superman and Lois Lane, the series would also star Jack Larson as Jimmy Olsen, the young photojournalist who just adores Lois Lane and Clark Kent. He idolizes them like parental figures. Now, George Reeves, Phyllis Coates, and Jack Larson, they all thought, yeah, why not make this little show, shoot it, make a few $1,000 for the summer, because nobody will ever see it. All right, now this is my favorite part of filming all of these story location tours, when I get to show you these, I don't know, to me they're just wild fun facts that this one makes me, I just get goosebumps. Well, maybe not on a hot day like today, especially while hiking all the way up to the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook, but totally worth it. Views for days. And for the 8th episode of The Adventures of Superman, called The Mind Machine, they brought production up here. We're now just a little south of Culver City, and I hiked up here to show you the back of Culver Studios, Amazon Studios. Now, there were very few location shoots for season 1. Most of the scenes were filmed on the soundstage, but they did venture out a couple of times. And remember the backlot I mentioned, the one that Selznick burned? Well, it was part of what they called 40 acres. And from this spot, we can see where 40 acres used to be. It was the backlot behind the studios, where they would build city streets and town squares and all that. Well, it was Selznick's Atlanta for Gone with the Wind, and it's where Tara, Scarlett O'Hara's mansion, was built, where George Reeves, as the Tarleton twin, has his big scene. And this is the part, the goosebumps. In this episode of Superman, George can be seen standing right in front of Tara, as Clark Kent and as Superman. But by 1951, Tara, now 12 years old, was dilapidated and falling apart. Oh, the irony of it all, or coincidence, whatever you want to call it. Getting a peek at the ruins of Gone with the Wind, where just over a decade earlier, George had kicked off his Hollywood career. I mean, did he stand up here gazing out at it, remembering what it must have felt like to land his first role? I mean, what must he have thought while looking out at it all? Did he care? Did it even faze him? It's really fascinating to wonder. I mean, was the irony lost on him that sitting in the background were the decaying remains of his very first professional gig, as his new career was metaphorically and physically about to take off? Like I said, they didn't really do too many location shoots in season 1. They did use the old Hal Roach studios. They were equipped with a soundstage needed for a specific scene that the Culver studios didn't have. The Hal Roach studios, they were demolished a long time ago. Also, production, they went out to Griffith Park Observatory for some exterior shots. The observatory doubled as a laboratory. It's way too hazy out today to see the observatory, but if you look closely, you can see the Hollywood sign.
Superman.
The children are all right, Miss Lane. Just a little shaken up.
Oh, thank goodness. And Wagner, what about him?
See for yourself.
Is he dead?
Speaking of goosebumps, the episode features Superman up here saving a bunch of kids who were on a runaway school bus. I mean, come on. And there's a bus up here? Are you kidding me? You see it, right? I'm not imagining it. It's just so perfect that I happened to come up here and film. Well, there's a school bus. Mulholland Drive, my absolute favorite street in all of LA, no question. More so at night. Sunset Boulevard is a close second, but Mulholland is my vibe. It's pretty much as high up as we can get, and the views are just unrivaled. It's just a magical long and winding road in my eyes. Mulholland also connects the canyons, Laurel Canyon, Coldwater Canyon, and the one we're in now, Benedict Canyon. Now, since our story is about to start going a little darker, let me tell you about this canyon's dark past. It's where Sharon Tate was living at the time of the horrific Manson murders. It's where MGM producer / director Paul Byrne was found shot to death in his home just weeks after marrying movie star Jean Harlow. Oh, let's see. In 2011, the mummified body of a B-movie actress and Playboy bunny named Yvette Vickers was found. Her dead body apparently went unnoticed for over a year. And just a few months ago, 3 women in their late 20s and early 30s were shot to death outside of a home here. I think they're still trying to figure out what happened there. But there you go. The dark side of this otherwise beautiful Benedict Canyon, where George Reeves was now calling home. I would say that about halfway down the canyon from Mulholland Drive and, well, actually, it's probably a tad bit closer to Sunset Boulevard, but basically right here in about the center of Benedict Canyon sits a modest, beautiful little 2-bedroom, 3-bath, 1,700 square foot home. And if you want to know how particular I am about making these tours, I was planning on doing this story last winter, but when I drove by this house, all of the gorgeous landscaping was, well, in winter form. And the ending of our story will take place in the summertime, June, so I really wanted you to see it as close to how it looked back then because, really, another goosebump moment, this house looks the exact same as it did back in 1947 when it was built. And a few years later, around 1951, George Reeves moved in. It's where he lived while making Superman, and it's where he would eventually die. It is really unique to get to tell you a story that's over 50 years old from a location that looks hauntingly the same. What's not the same, though, is its worth. This house is worth over $1 million today, but when George moved in, it cost $12,000. He didn't pay that. He couldn't. He didn't have enough money. His name was on the deed, but it was paid for by a woman named Toni Mannix. A much better name than what was given to her at birth. She was born Camille Bernice Frumes on February 19th, 1906 in New York City. She tried to have a career in show business. She was a dancer and an actress who eventually moved her way out to Hollywood and began acting in what were then called talkies, films with sound. Now, going by the name Toni Lanier, she became a Ziegfeld Follies showgirl and even appeared in the 1936 MGM film The Great Ziegfeld. In the mid-30s, she also met the general manager for MGM, Joseph Edward Mannix, or Eddie as he was known. Eddie was also known as the Fixer. Fans of Ray Donovan will know what a fixer is. He was paid quite nicely to cover up the scandalous wild lives of Hollywood stars, making their problems go away. And Toni became his mistress. Eddie, though, was married to a woman, ironically named Bernice, but they were both Catholic, so a divorce was out of the question. Until Bernice had had enough and decided to end the marriage once and for all. However, before the divorce could become officially filed, Bernice died in a car accident outside Palm Springs. Now, with Bernice out of the equation, Eddie and Toni could live freely as husband and wife, and the two married in 1951. Shortly after their marriage, or some say even maybe slightly before, Tony met a strapping, handsome actor, George Reeves. She was 8 years older than George and was in her mid-40s when they met, but the two hit it off in more ways than one. This wasn't much of a problem, however, because Eddie had a mistress of his own. He had apartments and houses all over Southern California where they could cavort, and Tony didn't really mind because she would have her own fun. That fun between Tony and George only intensified, and the two became much more than just lovers. Now, yes, Tony paid most of George's bills. She bought him nice things, even cars, and this house. Although Tony knew it was going to be the house where they would play out their affair, which, by the way, lasted for over 7 years. Their relationship, it was an open secret in Hollywood circles. Also, even though Eddie had his own mistress, he loved Tony and really only cared about making her happy. George Reeves made Tony happy. And this arrangement worked for all 4 parties involved, and it never really appeared in the press because nobody dared cross Eddie Mannix. He was way too rich and way too powerful. Hilariously enough, though, the two couples, they even double dated. Eddie and his mistress, and Tony and her man, George. This would allow them to eat in public together without people being too suspicious. People would just see this foursome out and about, and it just appeared that husband and wife, Tony and Eddie, were out on a double date. Also, George Reeves, he had to keep up appearances and had to make sure that America's beloved Superman was an upstanding gentleman. He never took Tony to any public appearances. The two kept a very low and discreet profile, often just holing up together in this little love nest of theirs.
Hello there. This is George Reeves, your candid reporter for Kellogg's. You know, the greatest name in cereals. And now, we'd like to take you into the home of our guest star. Why, it's me. Perhaps you know me better as Superman or Clark Kent, who's actually taking these pictures, probably. That's my little schnauzer. Oh, not in the mouth, Sam. He's reminding me it's time for breakfast. Here we go. Kellogg's cornflakes do go fast and are easy to run out of. But I always keep a spare. Kellogg's cornflakes are packaged sunshine. Fresh, crispy, and flavorful flakes from corn which lives with the sun longer than any other grain. You see, judo was my hobby, and that's my judo outfit. Well, we'll do a few one-arm push-ups. And then, we're ready for a series of judo falls. In judo, these are called number 5 falls. Over, and over, and over once again. Well, what is that? Well, now, there is the real muscle builder, Kellogg's cornflakes. Thank you for visiting with us. I do hope I'll see you soon. Aren't you putting on weight?
The Adventures of Superman made its debut on September 19th, 1952, and was a surprise hit. Big enough to resume production and go for season 2, which they filmed right here at what was then known as California Studios. Real creative name there. We're actually just across the street from Paramount Pictures. This place used to be operated by famous players. It's also another studio in town that gets to say that Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford made movies here. 2 Best Picture winners were filmed here. The Best Years of Our Lives from 1946, and In the Heat of the Night, which came out in 1967. Today, it's known as Raleigh Studios, but back in 1953 and 54, The Adventures of Superman, they had a new executive producer, Whitney Ellsworth. He took over from Robert Maxwell. Maxwell decided to go make a little TV show called Lassie. Ellsworth, he had worked on season 1. He's even credited as developing the show alongside Maxwell, but now he had been bumped up to executive producer and would keep that title for the remainder of this series. Ellsworth really was a big name in DC Comics. He did a lot: writer, story editor, and of course producer. And also, the show found a sponsor. Took a while, but Kellogg's signed on, America's food manufacturing corporation. As in, George was also doing cereal commercials now, along with the rest of the cast, who, by the way, had each gotten a slight pay bump, I think like $25 or $50 per episode. Another major change occurred with season 2. Phyllis Coates had accepted other offers after season 1 wrapped and wasn't available to continue with this series. So the part of Lois Lane was recast with an actress named Noelle Neal. Noelle, she was born in 1920, started out as a chorus girl, and she signed a contract with Paramount and also modeled. You know that Betty Grable pinup poster? The best-selling poster during World War II? Well, Noelle, she had a pinup poster also, and apparently was ranked number 2. She did a ton of small parts here and there. She even appeared in back-to-back Best Picture winners, An American in Paris in 1951 and The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952. The following year, though, she would come back to the role of Lois Lane. Yes, back. She, oddly enough, played Lois Lane in 2 Superman serials I mentioned earlier, one in 1948 and one in 1950. With Phyllis Coates now unavailable, producers reached out to Noelle, and for the rest of the series, Lois Lane would be played by her. This tour just would not be complete without a visit to Tarzana. One of the location shots from a season 2 episode called The Man Who Could Read Minds was filmed right out here in front of this house on Wilbur Avenue. They filmed all along this street. There was a stakeout and a chase scene. You can see some great old cars in it too. They also film along Lynette, this street here. I watched the episode this morning and I even noticed the same fire hydrant right here in the same spot where it was back in June of 1953 when production camped out here for the filming.
You men take North Brandwood Drive, through slowly. Remember, he's powerfully armed and dangerous.
Last night, Ace reporters James Olson and Lois Lane Lois Lane and James Olson captured the notorious Phantom burglar as he emerged from the scene of his latest robbery. These 2 fearless reporters...
Jimmy, stop the car. Someone just came out of that house.
It's him.
The police. Let's get to a phone.
No, I'm gonna get him.
Now, in total, George Reeves did 104 episodes in the series run. Jack Larson did 102, and right behind him was John Hamilton, who played Perry White, the editor at the Daily Planet. Then, with 90 episodes, you have Robert Shane, who played Inspector Henderson. Noelle Neal did 78 episodes, and Phyllis Coates did 24. And what makes this spot so unique and special is that it marks the only time that all 5 of these characters appeared in the same shot. And if that's a fun fact that thrills you, just imagine how the fans of Superman feel. They raised enough money to have this plaque marking this very occasion. I think it's just so fantastic. I've visited a lot of filming locations around town, and there just aren't that many that have plaques dedicated to them. I think there should be more. I think it's great. This one was dedicated on August 16th, 2014, commemorating the 100th birthday of George Reeves. But of these 5 actors, only Jack Larson was alive in 2014. And also, I want to tell you about the spring of 1953, too. George Reeves, he filmed a small role for one of my all-time favorite films, From Here to Eternity, which was released later that summer. This would mark the second time that George would appear in a Best Picture Oscar winner, after Gone with the Wind, of course. But there's an urban legend attached to it that I think unfairly follows George. The rumor goes that there was a test screening of From Here to Eternity, and that audiences started laughing and shouting, "Hey, look, it's Superman," when George's character appeared. So producers supposedly drastically cut George's scenes. This just isn't true. George never had a large role. The character in the novel has a much bigger role, but that happens all the time. Characters get cut down when being adapted into screenplays. Also, Superman hadn't even been on a full year yet when the movie came out, and I just don't think it was popular enough yet to distract audience members. Also, several people involved with the making of From Here to Eternity have denied this myth, saying that George barely even filmed more than what you see in the final cut. It's just become this urban legend created to parallel George's internal struggle with being typecast in the role of Superman.